Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, January 22nd, 2024. And today I've got a status report, some updates and news from the 10th Amendment and nullification movement. Some important legislation has already moved forward in places like New Hampshire, even Wisconsin, and in Missouri. Plus, I'm going to point you to a bunch of bills up for consideration defending the Second Amendment from constant federal attacks, rejecting financial surveillance in support of sound money, and much more. But first, a quick reminder of the strategy that we use on how to stop the feds without waiting for the federal government to magically do something that it absolutely never does, which is limit its own power. And for that, let's go to the founders, well, a couple of them at least, just to highlight what we work on. Hear from James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, writing in Federalist number 46 on how to defeat federal power by individuals and states. And he said that they should use legislative devices on the state level or local level, because that's part of the state, and a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's James Madison in Federalist number 46. There's also Alexander Hamilton, if we want to include everybody. We want to be inclusive here. So even Hamilton. Here he is in Federalist number 33 discussing the limits of power delegated to the federal government in the Constitution, and of course rejecting the notion that the Supremacy Clause would authorize unlimited federal power. He said, acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. An act of usurpation is not law. An act of usurpation is actually a theft of power from the sovereign or final authority, the people of the several states. And so if they're stealing power, you don't just abide by it and beg the thief to just give it back. You reject it or you push back in various ways. Now, we've covered this in many, many episodes. I do want to point you to one because I've got a zillion examples of supporters of the Constitution saying basically the same thing. It's up to the people and the states to keep the federal government in check when the feds refuse to follow the rules. And for us, that's 24/7, 365. I covered this in, here's one episode, how to respond to unconstitutional acts. That will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty a couple hours after the live stream is done here this morning. Now, these tools of using the states and legislative devices and the people refusing to cooperate with officers of the Union, they don't do much good unless the people in the states actually use them. So with that, let's take a look at some of the ways that people are trying to use these tools here in 2024. And I want to point to a bill that passed in Utah, in the Utah Senate. It has to go through the Utah House still. Senate Bill 57. This passed just last week, Friday, by a vote of 22-9. So I think it was probably party lines. But this is actually not it's not a bad bill. It just doesn't do amazing things. It sets the foundation for them to do stuff that they already have the authorization to do. Hopefully I can make sense. On Friday, this is a report by Mike Meharry, the Utah Senate passed a bill titled the Constitutional Sovereignty Act that would create a process to end state and local enforcement of some federal actions in the state and set the stage to stop them in practice and effect. So this is from Senator Scott Sandell, House Senate Bill 57 in Utah. And Mike writes that under the proposed law, the Utah legislature would have the authority to pass a concurrent resolution prohibiting a state or a local government officer, so anybody who works for the state or local government, from enforcing or assisting in the enforcement of what they call a federal directive within the state. So federal acts, federal executive orders, federal laws, whatever, federal regulations, etc. If the legislature determines that that federal directive, for example, violates the principles of state sovereignty, if they think that the federal government shouldn't be doing it, or if they think it's a bad policy because it's infringing on the choices that the people of the state of Utah should be making, they can introduce and pass, if they decide to, pass a concurrent resolution and just specifically explain, hey, we're going to stop complying or not complying, but stop participating in helping the federal government implement or effectuate this particular act or regulatory program. If it passes, I think, by 2/3 vote, and then the governor signs it, it goes into impact, in effect, absolutely at that moment. So it's like an emergency measure. Now, would you be surprised that the mainstream media is absolutely going nuts about this? Mind you, it's not ending the enforcement of anything today. They're just saying, well, this is the process we're going to use. We're going to look at anything that the federal government has on the books, anything that the federal government might try to throw at us at some point in the future, and we're just going to say, hey, it's hands off. If you guys want to do this, you figure out how to do this. Now, the Salt Lake Tribune, of course, hates it. And here, the title of the report that they put out on this one, Can Utah Ignore Federal Laws and Regulations? Legal precedent says no, but legislators want to try. Now, I could spend an entire episode just taking apart this particular report. Unfortunately, even one of the supporters of the bill has no idea what the bill is doing or the legal precedent behind it. So we shouldn't be surprised that the people who hate the principles of the Constitution, who don't even claim to support this type of stuff, are going to be railing against it when even the good guys, some of the good guys who are supposed to be the good guys, are getting it wrong. So here's how they put it. On Thursday, now it goes through 2 votes. So it had 1 vote on Thursday and the final vote on Friday when it officially passed the state Senate, and now it is in the state House. So on Thursday, the Utah Senate advanced a bill to create a process that allows the legislature to ignore federal laws and regulations if they think those mandates are unconstitutional. Now, there's already 2 errors in that first sentence. First of all, it doesn't say that the Utah legislature is ignoring anything. The Utah legislature isn't required by the federal government to participate in the enforcement of anything the federal government does. The Utah legislature doesn't do any of that anyway, so the legislature isn't complying or ignoring. And they are not saying it only if they think the measure is unconstitutional. Of course, there are various ways that they can determine a federal directive should not be enforced in the state. One of them in the legislation is they think it's their opinion that it goes beyond the limits of the 10th Amendment, or if it just is bad policy. So it's not only about constitutionality. Actually, the legislation gets this right. This report gets it wrong. Usually it's a little bit of both. So that's actually technically incorrect on that because no one's ignoring anything. They're just saying, hey, we don't think you should be, we don't like this, and you can figure out how to enforce it. We're just not going to help you. And I'm going to get to the legal doctrine behind that, which the Salt Lake Tribune and almost everyone else seems to be absolutely clueless about. And they say, however, the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that states do not have such authority. Now, again, if we read the text of the legislation, it just says we're going to stop enforcing. They're not going to impede federal officials. They're not trying to make the law, overturn the law, like basically replacing the Supreme Court, which is what it seems like the Salt Lake Tribune is complaining. What they're doing is they're using a long-held legal precedent that the Supreme Court has upheld from 1842 all the way, most recently, I think it was 2018, in a series of 5 major cases. Now, the first quote that I cited today was from James Madison. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, told us that the way to keep the federal government in check is for states to use legislative devices and for states and individuals to refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. So if the father of the Constitution says this is how you keep the feds in line when they go beyond what they're supposed to be doing, and Madison even said this is for what he called unwarrantable measures that you think are unconstitutional, or warrantable but unpopular, bad policy. constitutional. It's the same process. Just stop helping them. Stop participating. That's how you bring these programs to an end without having to rely on the federal government to magically limit its own power, which never happens. So the Supreme Court has actually upheld this viewpoint in a series of cases. They've long held, this is another article by Mike Meharry, they've long held that states do not have to actively participate in the enforcement or effectuation of federal acts or regulatory programs. There's a series of cases. 1842 is Prigg versus Pennsylvania. This will be linked to in the show notes so you can get an overview of each of these cases, and you can go and read them on your own time if you want to read the whole thing. But the main one that most people cite on this is Prince versus United States in 1997. This is one of the good ones from Scalia. He said the federal government may neither issue, So this was already upholding 1842, another case in 1992, so it's reiterated. We just keep seeing it, support the same thing over and over and over. And of course, we don't want to rely on the Supreme Court to tell us what we have permission to do, but certainly when they do get it right, it is certainly a lot easier to make the case because these people don't even know what they're talking about in the Salt Lake Tribune. So the federal government may neither issue directives requiring states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal act or regulatory program or federal regulatory program. It matters not whether policymaking is involved, and no case-by-case weighing of the burdens or benefits is necessary. Such commands are fundamentally incompatible with our constitutional system of dual sovereignty. I mean, I could talk about this dual sovereignty thing, but the short version is, if the federal government passes something, it is up to the federal government to figure out how to do it. Now, if the states agree, let's say they say, okay, well, we're going to agree to do this for X amount of loot. Well, then they've made an agreement, and if they violate that agreement, they're going to stop getting the money that they were promised to get in order to help the feds. And that's how it happens a lot of times. So, I mean, if they lose money, they lose money. Sooner or later, someone's got to stop taking these bribes. And I know during the process, someone in Utah actually tried to include an amendment to basically poison pill the legislation by adding some text that said we won't use this in any situation where we might lose money. So basically all of them. So if the feds stop handing out loot and the states just stop complying with them, it makes a big difference. Anyways, here, the most recent case in the anti-commandeering doctrine is Murphy versus NCAA in 2018. This was a sports betting case, and Samuel Alito wrote for the majority. I think it was 6-3, maybe it was 7-2. It was easy peasy on this one. The anti-commandeering doctrine may sound arcane, but it is simply the expression of a fundamental structural decision incorporated into the Constitution. For example, the decision to withhold from Congress the power to issue orders directly to the states. Conspicuously absent from the list of powers given to Congress is the power to issue direct orders to the governments of the states. The anti-commandeering doctrine simply represents the recognition of this limit on congressional authority. So House or Senate Bill 57 in Utah is basically just saying this is how we're going to use this legal doctrine and what so many other states have been doing for so long on things like cannabis legalization in response to the Real ID Act and the like, just saying we're not going to do this. Of course, the immigration sanctuaries, cities and states have been following this particular legal precedent for a long time. And every time it goes to federal court, the federal court rules against the federal government because of this long-standing legal principle. So the idea that a state can't do this on other issues just shows how partisan these clowns really are in the mainstream media. Anyway, so let's move to the next one. Talking about opting out, I think one of the easiest, well, it's not easy politically, but structurally and under the system, one of the easiest ways to opt out of a federal program is the federal asset forfeiture equitable sharing program, equitable sharing asset forfeiture program. And in Hawaii, there's a Senate Bill 2124 from Senator Joy Van Buenaventura and a couple of co-sponsors, which would reform the state-level civil asset forfeiture program and then actually withdraw the state from a significant portion of the federal equitable sharing program. And here from Meharry's report on this, law enforcement agencies and the federal program is so dangerous because as soon as you require a criminal conviction for asset forfeiture on a state level, all the law enforcement in the state, every time they want to actually use asset forfeiture, they don't follow the state process. They use this federal process called adoption and equitable sharing, and they turn everything into a federal case because they can find some federal law or regulation. There's tens of thousands of them on the books to claim that it's a federal program, and then therefore they can start following federal law. This is really, really bad stuff. So Mike writes that law enforcement agencies can circumvent more strict state forfeiture laws by claiming cases are federal in nature, drug laws, gun laws, etc. Under these arrangements, state officials simply hand cases over to a federal agency, participate in the case, basically they do all the work still, and then receive up to 80% of the proceeds. So instead of getting 100% or 0% now that they're required to get criminal conviction on a state level in some states, then they would get zero. So they say, well, we'll just work with our buddies, our federal partners, and then all of a sudden we'll get 80% of the take when we would have got nothing. However, when a state merely withdraws from participation, this federal directive loses its impact. And Senate Bill 2124 in Hawaii, of all places, I don't know if this is going to move forward, but it's cool to see it there. I keep mentioning to Mike Meharry and Alan Mosley and a few other people that maybe, get a couple of good things. We might have to have an office, a 10th Amendment Center office in Honolulu one of these days, but I doubt it. Anyway, so Senate Bill 2124 directly addresses this federal equitable sharing loophole with this language. A seizing agency or prosecuting attorney shall not enter an agreement to transfer or refer property seized unless the seized property includes currency, U.S. currency, in excess of $100,000. This is a vast majority. We've seen some reports in some areas that if you include that, that's somewhere around 90% of the time. We'd like to have it in all situations, but should they pass this, this would reduce Hawaii's participation in federal equitable sharing asset forfeiture by about 90%. So that would be huge. There's a similar piece of legislation being considered in Colorado. Now, in 2017, they passed a law already restricting civil asset forfeiture and this participating in the federal program. And that one restricted or prohibited law enforcement agencies from transferring seized property to a federal agency unless it has a net value more than $50,000. Now, notice in the Hawaii bill, you had to have currency of $100,000 or more. So it's pretty easy to say that, we're going to seize a house or a boat or a car and a couple of other things, and all of a sudden you're over $50,000. But even in that scenario, according to the Colorado Municipal League, because when this passed, they did some research on it, they said this is about 80 to 85% of all forfeiture transfers from the state of Colorado to the federal government. So just at that level, combining all property in a seizure situation reduced transfers to the federal government by about 80 to 85%. Now, language in this new piece of legislation, which I think is up for a hearing in the first week of February here, would further restrict Colorado law enforcement from participating in the federal program. So it would restrict it to only in cases where it was a U.S. currency in excess of $50,000. So again, restricting it step by step, further by bit by bit, as Thomas Jefferson told us, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. I think these are big steps. A lot of people, every time we report on a small step or a mid-sized step or a large step, they always complain that you didn't get 100%, but you're definitely not going to go from where we are today, the largest government in history, to the land of the free in one fell swoop. None of these programs are ever wiped out. And generally what I see happen in all my years doing this type of work since 2006 is when people try to do too much, it never goes anywhere. It always gets voted down. So these steps, if we see building upon each other, can have a strong impact. Now, moving forward, I want to talk about financial privacy. Of course, once the Patriot, there was always all kinds of financial surveillance and the federal control over the banking system, but post 9/11, post Patriot Act, certainly the federal government has really, really got its dirty hands in the dirty banking system and the entire financial system, from credit card processing and the like. I know we are hearing in some reports that X and Elon Musk is planning on implementing payments, but certainly if he just uses the traditional banking system, then they'll be able to use that as a leverage to say, well, you're letting the wrong people on here, we're going to cut you off. And that's how they do this type of thing. And one of the ways we've seen this kind of be pushed for in the last few years, and most aggressively in late 2022, was on the purchase and sale and any commerce in firearms, firearm accessories, and ammunition. Some politicians and some big banking people have been pushing for a number of years to create something called a merchant category code. If you do any type of small business or large business and you run credit card processing, you know that your business is assigned a merchant category code, MCC, a membership organization, for example, a sporting goods store, a cafe and restaurant, a web publishing, a printer, whatever it may be. There are various categories. And one of the things that the gun grabbers want to do, of course, is keep track of who is buying what, who is selling what, because they want to know. They want a registry of what everyone owns. And I know you can pay for cash for firearms and accessories and ammunition. But many people need to purchase online, for example, or people want to do that. And the more that you restrict the ability of people to do commerce into only certain areas or only certain types of transactions, that is a soft form of gun control. So what they are trying to do is turn every electronic purchase into a greater form of surveillance than it already is by adding an MCC, merchant category code, to all retailers specifically selling a firearm. So now if you go to a big sporting goods store and you buy a bunch of baseball bats and some beach equipment and maybe a kayak and then a shotgun, they're not going to be able to tell if you purchased just the kayak or the shotgun. They want to know specifically, like this specific transaction is associated with a firearm. They may not know exactly what it is, but then they'll be able to know who's owning stuff. But in Wisconsin, we saw a bill called, I think most people call it the Second Amendment Financial Privacy Act. I'm not a big fan of that name because, well, for many reasons. In New Hampshire, they call it the Firearms Purchaser Financial Privacy Act. But in Wisconsin, they actually passed this legislation. Here, let me read from the report here. The Wisconsin Assembly last week, Thursday, gave final approval to a bill that would prohibit credit card processors operating in the state from requiring a credit card merchant code that would enable the tracking of firearms and ammunition purchases. This is Senate Bill 466. It passed the Senate by a vote of 22-10, which is a veto-proof majority. And that was last week, Tuesday. And then Thursday this last week, the Assembly passed it with a vote of 62-35. I believe that is too shy of a veto override, and they had 2 on the red team not voting. So they might have 64 votes on this. I'm almost certain is going to get vetoed. But they may be able to override that veto. I've seen them override a few things recently. Maybe they're at least one. But it's not super common. But it is good to see this type of legislation move forward in Wisconsin. And one of the reasons it's so important to have this type of stuff move forward is because once they really started pushing for this in late 2022, we started seeing legislation get introduced in a handful of states in early 2023, early last year. And just after it was introduced and being considered in 4 or 5 different states, the major credit card processors, they basically officially put it on pause, saying they did not want a patchwork of legislation in various states before they tried getting credit card processors to start implementing this. So just having it introduced got them to pause it. Now, in the last year, 2023, there's a number of states who've passed this into law, so it is already banned to do this in Mississippi, Idaho, North Dakota, Montana, Texas, and Florida. So if we add on maybe Wisconsin, maybe a handful of other states, I covered this in some detail in an episode last April, Nullification win, Second Amendment Financial Privacy Act. We've got a bunch of other states that are considering similar legislation. So if Wisconsin doesn't pass it, maybe someone else will. But if merely introducing it got them to back down temporarily, getting 10 to 15 states to get this passed on the books, we're maybe close to halfway there or a third of the way there. We really need to keep pushing forward to make sure this doesn't come to fruition. So New Jersey, we also see New Jersey has Senate Bill 1866. In Tennessee, there's House Bill 1784 and Senate Bill 1702. In Oklahoma, there's House Bill 3221 and Senate Bill 814. In Indiana, there's going to be a committee hearing on House Bill 1084, probably a vote on that committee hearing just this week. So that's on Thursday, the Second Amendment Financial Privacy or Firearms Purchasers Financial Privacy Act. And then the New Hampshire bill has a committee hearing and I think a work session, possible vote on January 31st. That's House Bill 1186. So these are all the Second Amendment financial privacy acts that we are monitoring so far. There's probably one or two that I'm missing, but I'm doing my best to put this all together. Now, I'm citing all kinds of stuff in this episode, legislation, episodes, a couple of original source documents from Madison and Alexander Hamilton, of all people. If you want to find that, Alan Mosley will get all the links organized for a blog post for this episode, like we do for every episode. And we'll get that published. I'll get that published a couple of hours after this live stream is done here today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. So if you're saying, hey, I want to support Indiana House Bill 1084, I live in Indiana, you just go to the website, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You're going to find all the links to that report and the legislation. You can contact your state representative and say, hey, support House Bill 1084, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll find that all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while I'm here, I should take a quick moment and say hello and thank you to everyone who's joined me here on the live stream and everyone who is watching or listening here in the archive later on. I really appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. There's Kirk Morrison, Howard Clegg, Cheriton Farmer, Senator D.T., Dixie Strong, Anna Banana Republic, that's a great screen name, Paul Mullen, King Nobody, Sin Nobre, Hardknack Farms, Jacob, and everyone else. I know I'm missing a few people, but I'm scrolling through. There's Sonny Bono and a few others. Thank you so much for watching, but let's get right back to it. I've got a lot of stuff to cover. So we've already covered the firearms purchasers' financial privacy. I got to train myself to do that rather than call it Second Amendment financial privacy, whatever works. Civil asset forfeiture. We're also talking about the Utah Constitutional Sovereignty Act. But then there's also the Defend the Guard Act. If we're talking about the largest government, largest empire in history, what can you do against the empire? Well, maybe stop participating just like they did back in, against Madison's war in 1812. I'll get to that in a moment, maybe if I have time. Here from New Hampshire. They passed the Defend the Guard Act, House Bill 229, out of the State House by a vote of 187 to 182. It is the second legislative chamber to do so in modern times, following the Arizona Senate just last year. And here from an overview of the bill, titled the Defend the Guard Act, the legislation would prohibit the governor from releasing any unit or member of the New Hampshire National Guard into active duty combat, so specifically into fighting a war, unless one of these specific constitutional requirements is met. One, the Congress has passed, this is from the legislation itself, Congress has passed an official declaration of war or has taken an official action pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution to explicitly call forth the Guard to do what the Constitution says they can do. So in other words, something that they actually haven't done properly since World War II. They're going to say, we're not going to participate should this pass into law. From my understanding, the governor is a big neocon Nikki supporter there, so who knows how that'll go. But it's certainly important to continue pushing for it because sometimes we see bills like this take a few tries to get through. This is on the second year of this particular legislation, House Bill 229. It went through the committee process in 2023, and the sponsors were really good about this. Rather than they saw that it was probably going to get voted down, I believe, in committee, which means once it goes to the full House, it's definitely going to get killed in New Hampshire. And so I think they did the right strategy, and they said, hey, let's put this through, let's defer this till the fall. And then they finally had the committee vote once there was enough grassroots support, and it got through the committee without a specific recommendation. And again, a lot of grassroots support in the Free State. It still only passed 187 to 182. So that tells you how difficult this type of thing is to get through state legislatures. But that is a big step in New Hampshire. And then speaking of Arizona, there's also House Bill 2181. They're going for another round on this. It passed through the state Senate last year. I think it was Senator Wendy Rogers, who I believe is pretty popular there. But then on the House side, the leadership wouldn't even let it go through the committee process. So it's interesting to see how Representative Alexander Collodin, I'm not sure if I'm saying the name right, I apologize, Alex, if I get that wrong, but has 13 co-sponsors, and they're starting on the House side with House Bill 2181. Very similar in legislation to what has already been passed out of the New Hampshire House and what they passed in the Arizona Senate last year. So if they can get it through the House, we know the Senate has already approved it in Arizona, and it would be really interesting to see how that plays out. And there's a bunch of other states considering this type of bill. In Maryland, there's House Bill 229. They're having a committee hearing on that just next week on the 30th of January. There's Kentucky, House Bill 149. Tennessee, House Bill 1609. Michigan, Senate Bill 642. South Carolina, House Bill 4533, and Missouri, House Bill 1521. So if you want to take on the empire, the unconstitutional wars, you got to support the Defend the Guard Act, because calling Congress and begging Congress to stop doing what Congress, well, isn't even taking responsibility for by just deferring to the executive branch decade in and decade out, that has been a totally failed strategy. This isn't going to bring it to an end, but it certainly is a powerful first step. And I covered this strategy in at least some detail on how it was used pretty aggressively by a number of New England states in response to what they called Mr. Madison's War, the War of 1812. That episode, Don't Try, They'll Crush You, because, of course, the opponents of this type of effort always say, you can't do this. They'll just shut you down. And I pointed out in that episode a bunch of examples of how this works, has been used, and used successfully, because this is absurd to say, don't try. That's the worst thing to actually do is don't try. That'll be linked to in the show notes as well at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Let's talk about the Second Amendment and our natural right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms. In West Virginia, House Bill 4577, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, would ban any person, including any public officer or employee of the state and its political subdivisions, from enforcing any past, present, or future federal acts, laws, executive orders, administrative orders, court orders, rules, or regulations that infringe on the right to keep and bear arms. To me, that's all of them. Maybe West Virginia will read that far more narrowly than I would read it, because, of course, my view is that the number of federal gun control measures that are authorized by the Constitution are zero. The ATF, the only thing it's authorized to do is disband. But that's another episode. The passage from Mike Meharry, he writes, the passage of this bill, which is similar to a law that's on the books in Missouri that has had some pretty big impact already. It is going through the federal court system process, and I believe there's a hearing on that in the beginning of February. I think Missouri's going to win that case, but even if they don't, we know how they ruled on this one, so it'd be pretty easy to make some modifications to get it through anyways. I'm fascinated that West Virginia seems to be, at least this representative or delegate, Charles Horst, seems to be so confident in the court case in Missouri winning on the Missouri side that they're going with almost the same legislation, because if they do win, then it's going to be a green light for every state to do this, rather than having to modify and play the little legal game that they try to do to slow us down. But that's a side note. The passage of this bill would be a huge improvement also over a fake gun sanctuary law passed in West Virginia during the 2021 legislative session. There's a number of states, Wyoming and elsewhere, where they've passed things that claim to be a Second Amendment sanctuary that actually is a sanctuary for nothing. This really bad legal language. That's what they did in West Virginia. So this would be an improvement on that. And we also see similar legislation, Legislature Bill 194, in Nebraska. It would prohibit state agencies and law enforcement officers from willfully enforcing a federal statute, order, rule, or regulation purporting to regulate a firearm, firearm accessory, or firearm ammunition that does not exist under the laws of this state. It would also bar any Nebraska government entity from utilizing assets, state funds, or funds allocated by the state to engage in any activity that aids a federal agency, federal agent, or corporation providing services to the federal government in the enforcement of the same. So basically, hands off. Now, they do say as long as it's not on the books in the state. And I think this is actually a really good strategy. Now, I also oppose all gun control on a state level. Just because I say the Second Amendment means all federal gun control measures should not exist, that doesn't mean I support state gun control, but certainly this creates an interesting 1-2 punch, because if they pass this and say we're not going to help the feds unless we're not going to participate or work with them on federal gun control enforcement unless we have the gun control measure here on a state level, that means as soon as this passes into law, they end enforcement of all kinds of stuff on a federal level, because they don't have a ton of stuff on them. It's not like California or New York there in Nebraska. But they can do some improvement, and the ATF puts out a handy sheet that we've got linked to in this report that lists all of the gun control measures in Nebraska. And then going forward, all you have to do is repeal a Nebraska law, and if there's a concurrent federal one, then they automatically stop participating in the enforcement of that one as well. That's the strategy used in Arizona. I think it's pretty interesting. Now, state or local agents guilty of violating the act would be subject to civil penalties of up to $3,000 on the first offense and Class 1 misdemeanor charges on a second offense. Some people tell you that's not enough, but, it's there. Local governments or agencies found guilty of violating the law would lose grant funds from the state in the following year. So using financial pressure, just like the feds do on the states and the people, using financial pressure to get localities to stop enforcing federal gun control, and of course, using state law to do that as well. Now, of course, if the state stops helping the federal government enforce federal gun control and everyone in the state still complies with federal gun control, then there is no conflict, there is no enforcement to even be worried about. Ultimately, it gets down to the people in all of these scenarios choosing to exercise their rights, whether government gives them permission to or not. Now, let's move on to Missouri, where the Constitutional Money Act, Senate Bill 735, passed out of its first committee just this last Wednesday. This bill would treat gold and silver as legal tender, basically putting it as what it should have been all along, which is treating it as money. It also would eliminate state capital gains tax on gold and silver. It would authorize the state to hold the metals in reserve and ban the state from seizing gold and silver, because we know governments have seized this stuff in the past. Now, it wasn't as effective as what they want us to believe, but we don't want government getting their dirty hands on this at all. The state would be required, Mike Meharry writes, to accept gold and silver for the payment of public debts. Private debts could be settled in gold and silver at the party's discretion. I like that that's in the legislation, basically making it just a choice. The more that we have competition in currency, Ron Paul used to introduce, back when he was in Congress, used to introduce a currency competition act all the time, basically suggesting that if people just have a choice, then they can actually learn about what real money is all about. And we see this playing out in places like Utah already, where I think I've seen as many as 50% of small businesses are now accepting the gold back, which is a voluntary, it's a real physical spendable gold note that people can use as money in Utah. And they're catching up in New Hampshire, and they haven't even treated gold and silver as legal tender in New Hampshire. They don't have any taxes. From what I've learned recently, they've never had taxes. So that's a real positive thing on that. And House Bill 1674 in New Hampshire would also make gold and silver legal tender in the state. It's up for a work session in a subcommittee on the 24th, so just on Wednesday of this week. There's also Indiana, House Bill 1400 and House Bill 1043 if we want other legislation on this. West Virginia, House Bill 4342. Kansas, Senate Bill 303. Florida, House Bill 697 and Senate Bill 750, and probably a few others. There's Oklahoma and a few others in Kentucky that we're monitoring and tracking on this, treating gold and silver as money, whether it's by removing taxes from it, because if you tax it, it's property or it's an investment vehicle. It's not money. Because if you think about how that plays out, if you have a sales tax on something, when government treats gold as property and you go to a store, let's just, for the sake of things, just pretend that everyone is complying the way that they shouldn't be doing, or the way that government wants them to. If you take in $5 worth of gold and you want to exchange it for $5 in U.S. fiat funny money, they'll say that you aren't just exchanging one form of money for another and equal. They're saying you're selling it or purchasing it. One person's selling, the other person's purchasing, and the state wants to get their grubby little mitts on 5 or 10 or 15%, whatever they want to tax it at. And then if you have capital gains tax, then they also want you to keep track of, well, I bought this gold at $1,000 value. Now the par value is worth $2,000. So then you have to actually calculate how much you gained and then pay them more taxes. And so all these taxes act as roadblocks. Power to tax is the power to destroy. And if you tax money, it's not money anymore. It's an investment vehicle or just mere property. Government taxes are a serious problem one way or the other. So anyways, New Hampshire, Indiana, West Virginia, Kansas, Florida, and a bunch of other states considering sound money legislation. And we've got a lot more on the way in 2024. If you want to learn in more detail what we've already gotten accomplished in various states on even more issues, our annual State of the Nullification Movement report for 2023 is available over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, and absolutely nothing helps us keep up to date on this legislation, report on it, share it with you, send it out to people so they can take action and support more. Nothing helps us more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. No pressure, no pressure. We have been doing this show here for over 4 years for free. We've got over 10,000 articles and blogs on the website. That'll continue happening. But if you want to help us continue expanding and growing and getting more wins on the books, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I went a little bit longer than I expected to. I tend to ramble a little bit, but I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you get out there and take action in support of this type of legislation in your state as much as possible. Of course, we'll be publishing the blog post on this over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, so you can find all the information and share it as widely as possible. I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty. Thanks so much for watching.